Hello, everyone. We are delighted to have here for this conversation with Iris Luke Piper, the head of immigration for the Work Rights Center. Luke has a long experience of working with EU nationals and non-EU nationals engaging and interacting with the migration systems in UK. So what I want to start our conversation with is basically asking you, Luke, how do you characterize the UK immigration system that is emerging after Brexit?
Hello, everybody. I would characterize it as complex, reactive, and doesn't always deliver on its stated objectives. I think it's a neat summary of where we are with the current UK immigration system.
What do you mean by, reactive and not delivering?
So there's a very complicated discussion to unpack when we look at the UK points-based system and the new immigration policies that emerged since the end of 2020. I say reactive, and reactive can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing, but I say reactive because in 2021, we didn't have a scheme dedicated to Ukrainian nationals fleeing a conflict. And that scheme, when it was brought in just a few years ago, was a really significant contributor to the numbers of migrants living in the UK. And it was a reaction, and it has had a really big impact in terms of the landscape of the numbers, but also the profile of migrants in the UK. When I say it doesn't always deliver on its stated objectives, I'm particularly pointing my finger at the points-based system, because the points-based system was characterized as fair. It was characterized as taking back control. It was characterized as something Australian, something that was something to be aspired to, and it has a lot of connotations of meritocracy and control and things like that. But the reality is that the points-based system that we have, the UK has had a points-based system since 2002, and various shapes and sizes. The points-based system that we have is very, very different to the Australian model, where the Australian model has quite a lot of flexibility within it. The UK's model is basically a one track, and the only flexibility within it is around the salary requirements. And even then, that's just dictated by the types of roles that you're looking to sponsor in. So it's unfair to say that we have a system that delivers on those stated objectives when it's not even what is described. And then finally, the complexity comes from the immigration rules themselves and the system to navigate. This is consistently felt by practitioners, immigration lawyers like me. Anybody looking at the immigration rules, I would invite them to say that they are anything but straightforward. They're intensely complex.
And I think there is a tension in the sort of the narrative of the government around the immigration system. On one hand, we have had all this emphasis on the fairness. This system is fairer than the previous one, which I would like to in a sense you already touched it a little bit upon, but I was wondering, what do you think about this characterization? Why they are so insistent on this idea of fairness? And the other one would be also how they can square it with the emphasis on the cutting the migration, reducing immigration. So it seems to be very much a system that is pulled and pushed in many directions at the same time.
Yeah, and I think in a political way that's quite convenient, because when you use words like fairness, fair to who, and fairness in contrast to what, and it's very difficult to sort of really assess that label of fairness, because the system that we currently have now was essentially in reaction to the mythos of Brexit. And I think we're very much stuck in a place where if we were to describe it as fair, it's really, really hard to measure fairness when we don't really have the clear definitions of what these things are and what they're agreed upon. From my perspective, I don't think we can characterize a system that's fair when it doesn't deliver a balance of opportunity and a balance of treatment and a balance of basic human decency, I suppose, is one way of putting it. And our current system that we have, particularly the points-based system, has a significant impact on the living conditions and the rights of certain migrants in the UK. And we're at a sort of really key moment at the moment where the structure of the points-based system, the way that it's being implemented and the way that it's being used, is producing a lot of abuse and a lot of exploitation to some very, very key areas of in some very key areas of the British economy where there is a lot of need, which is the care sector and the health sector. And what's really worrying is that the system that we have at the moment is producing unfairness and inequality and breaches of the law, which are not being wrestled with. Is it fair? It's most certainly not fair to the people who are coming to the UK using the sponsorship system and working here.
Some people tend to characterize the Australian point-based system as a government-led, while the British one as sponsors-led in many ways. And I think one of the risks of this relying too much on the role of the sponsor is, in a sense, create almost structural opportunities for exploitation or creating condition of dependency of the migrants on the sponsor. Is it something that you are really observing also from the work rights center perspective?
It's perhaps ironic that the points-based system that we have in the UK that's supposed to deliver control for the government doesn't actually place the control with the government. It places the control with the sponsor and with the employer. Yes, they have to comply with lots of rules. The rules are set by the government, and there is a very clear, robust framework that they have to go through. The problem is that it's completely reliant on the sponsors engaging with that process. Whether they comply with it, that's where the problems are, is in this issue of compliance. And what we see is amongst those who come to us for help, and of course it's going to be distorted because those who are coming to us are naturally in a moment of crisis. That it's just a product of how things are. But there is clearly a pattern amongst those who are coming to us from certain sectors, and there are very, very similar issues. You can see patterns of issues that emerge in these sponsorship relationships. So just as an example, a common feature is considerable fee charging for people to be sponsored here. I saw somebody the other day was tens of thousands of pounds that they were told that they had to pay to come work in the UK. We see examples of 0-hour contracting where people are told that they won't be paid their income unless they work specific hours, which is, the points-based system does allow for hourly work, but you have to pay people enough so that their salary will be the amount that's specified within the rules. What we see is people being sponsored to come here, either being overworked or not being given enough work to, let alone meet the requirements, but meet basic cost of living. And so we then see other practices of some of the more typical stuff that I think is very much reflected on in a lot of discussion around this, which is essentially sponsorship bonding, where the sponsorship and that power dynamic is used as a means of control, which in and of itself breeds exploitative practices and really bad employment behavior. And the threat of having that sponsorship withdrawn is very potent, it's very powerful, and it breeds a lot of insecurity. So a lot of people that we see are people who are fleeing these really toxic work environments and are trying to find alternative sponsors. And it's really hard to do that. And unfortunately, there have been a number of instances that have come to our way where people have moved from one bad employer to an even worse one. So it's a really unfortunate set of circumstances. And a lot of that is the reason why that exists is through lack of enforcement, through a lack of coherent enforcement structure of both the points-based system itself, but general good employment practice.
To what extent the people that you encounter that come to the work rights center in a way really understand the system? I mean, one of the concern in a sense is a system that is so complex is actually very difficult for someone who come from outside. I mean, it may be difficult for a lawyer. Imagine for someone who may be doing a range of jobs. But what is the result of this complexity, of the fact of not understanding the system? You know, I can imagine that a lot of people that not even understand what are the rights within this complex system. So who benefits from this bureaucratic situation?
Well, I think the the complexity isn't just the rules itself, but it's that understanding of what rights an individual has when they're working in the UK economy. And it's not as though you get given a pamphlet of telling you what your rights are in your own language and how to enforce them. And of course, people take advantage of that. And that's what we see is that practice of people not being aware of what their rights are, being, and even if they were or are aware, being disenfranchised to not empowered to be able to enforce those rights or be able to. And again, that the institutional problem here is that the regulators, the people responsible for ensuring that vulnerable people aren't being exploited, aren't doing anything. And that's in large due to lack of resources and a lack of coherent strategy, because our enforcement framework is so fractured in the UK. It's really difficult to see who exactly has responsibility for what, and encouraging the enforcement of the rules and the laws. So it's a bit of a perfect storm, really, that's been created, particularly in the care sector, where there is this combination of sponsorship system with its complexities, binding people to their employers on low pay in difficult employment circumstances, and a lack of enforcement structure that is essentially breeding some really unfortunate and disgusting practice.
Look, could you explain what may be the consequences, for example, for someone who is on a sponsorship visa somehow of um, in reporting the employer or even basically trying to move away from that job that is exploitative? Can this cause, for example, losing the right to stay in the country? I mean, what I'm thinking about is the new rules creating more precarity and uncertainty in terms of the right to stay for the people that get them.
Most certainly, because the conditions of a person's status to be in the UK under the points-based system is that they are employed by their sponsor. If they lose that sponsorship and they lose that employment, then the employer is under an obligation to tell the Home Office, and the Home Office will curtail that person's leave to be in this country, which means that their status will be cut short, usually to 60 days, and they will then have to find somebody else to employ them in that time frame. And that pressure is really tough. If you can't find somebody and you're essentially got that ticking clock, it creates a significant power imbalance. The risks are that if you lose your status, or it expires, or you fall at the end of that status and you're without it, the risks are that you become undocumented, and all of the issues that you will experience associated with that. Where it's particularly worrying in this particular context is that if you overstay your status for more than 14 days, that's it. You can't get back into the points-based system. You would have to leave the UK and apply to come back. But even then, depending on the period of overstaying, that has an impact on your ability to come back, because you will essentially be barred because you had a period of overstaying your status, and usually you have to wait for 12 months. So there are a lot of catches and a lot of trapdoors that you can fall within. And we've also seen some examples where some people unknowingly have been working for a different employer when they should have been working for their current sponsor, unknowingly that they were doing that. And that would be a breach of their visa conditions, which, if that was found out, they would then also that would then impact their ability to find a new sponsor. So there's massive layers of complexity and precarity depending on decisions that were made, or bad decisions that were made, not just by the individual, but crucially by the employer.
In terms of the sort of the legal infrastructure, so if to what extent do you have to then stay in the same sector where you had your initial, I mean, in a sense, you got those 2 months you mentioned to find a job, an alternative sponsor, but do you have a limitation in which kind of occupation you can look at?
You could move into any kind of occupation. The problem is finding that role to go into. A lot of the people that we're seeing in this situation of precariousness are people who are working in the care sector, and those roles are paid considerably less than the minimum salary that is that's generally part of the points-based system. The exceptions to the general rule that you have to pay, I mean, it will be in April over £36,000, but the general exceptions to this are in the public sector, largely in the health and social care sectors, and the pay difference is considerable. So you are working in a job that you're a care specialist in, but also the salary that you're being paid is competitively very, very low. So if you're trying to move into a different sector, say something more administrative based, you're in a situation where you're looking to move from a job where you're being paid comparatively a very low salary to one where it could be an additional £16,000 on top that your employer would have to pay you. So it's really not easy to move between types of jobs and roles, not least to mention that you would have to have the skill set to be able to get those roles. But when you have this range of issues that I've just described, you begin to see that people get locked in particular sectors and particular roles, and it makes it very difficult to break away from that if you're looking to move into different positions.
Apart from the care sector, are there particularly sectors that you seems to be more vulnerable to these situations of the rigidity of the system or potential for exploitation from your perspective?
So there is also the seasonal worker scheme, which was established to bring people to the UK to work in factories, largely fruit picking and food production areas. And this route gives people a 6-month immigration status, but they are linked to essentially an agency. There's a bank of a few agencies in the UK that are allowed to use this route to sponsor people, and they will then be given roles for a period of time, for a seasonal role in a farm that's essentially linked with this agency. This is a particular risky area, and again, we've seen examples of bad employment practice in this particular sector. It's well documented, but it's a growing area, because freedom of movement ending meant that employers in this sector were particularly having to focus on recruitment via the scheme, seasonal worker scheme, and that has, again, for the very similar to what we've just been describing now, singular employment bondage, fixed periods of leave, etc., are breeding, again, exploitative practices within some of these places of work.
Have you come across of situation where issues related to platformization were playing a role? the sense we see all the delivery and logistics sector, we see increasingly use of platform, but also as a way of creating sort of interim actor in the middle between the employer and the employees.
The rigid nature of the points-based system means that it doesn't allow for the multiple types of employment arrangements that exist in the employment market. So just as an example, zero-hour contracts are very attractive in certain sectors and with certain employers. The points-based system does not allow for that, because the expectation is that you're going to pay them a salary, so you're not undercutting the market by bringing in people to work in those roles. And that doesn't necessarily fit with certain employment sectors. And if you're sponsoring people into zero-hour contracts, that is hugely dangerous, simply because the only benefit of a zero-hour contract is that you have the opportunity to work for multiple employers and have that flexibility. If you're sponsored into a zero-hour contract, you can only work for that employer. And you can work an additional 20 hours in other places, but the reality is that you're locked into that arrangement. So there's no work, there's no pay, and it creates a spiral of precarious circumstances where we see a lot of destitution and massive cost of living problems, because people aren't able to get the hours, and if they are able to get the hours, they're not being paid enough. Just as another example, in some instances in the care sector, essentially businesses are contracted to provide services to people in their homes. So they will travel to a person's house to provide care services. Now, depending on the geography, that could involve a significant amount of travel time either side to get to the person's house and move around. And a lot of people they're not being paid for the travel. So they're only being paid for the time that they're in with the person doing the care work. So what you're seeing is people working 12-hour shifts plus more, 7 days a week, to try and meet their hours, just not because that's what they have to do to meet their obligations under their visa. Of course they have to do that, but just to live, just to have enough income to be able to get by. So there is a really big problem with the cost of living meeting the sponsorship system and these employment practices which the system isn't built to deal with and manage.
It's really fascinating to think about this misalignment between a managed migration system, or the idea of managing migration, and on the other end, a labor market that is really moving fast, is moving towards this precarization, this sort of flexibility, and there is completely. So some of the issues you are raising are really structural. So I was wondering, in terms of the role, the advocacy, or the role of sort of protecting workers' rights. So what spaces do you have? So if someone comes to you and finds themselves, so what kind of issues they come with, and what actually can you do?
It gets a bit disheartening at this point for a lot of sponsored employees. A lot of it is about escaping that situation and getting into a new, better one. So giving advice to people about what their options are in terms of where they can move to. Now, some people may have family members that can sponsor them, and that's wonderful because you can really help them in that situation. But a lot of people don't have that. So it's about identifying and supporting them with employability advice and giving them the tools to be able to identify new sponsors. In terms of enforcing employment rights, we also support people with bringing employment claims. But again, the risk with that is that you're not going to do that whilst you're still being employed by somebody. You've got to get out of that situation before you're going to be empowered to be able to do that. And even then, it's a terrifying prospect because of that power dynamic and that the precariousness of the immigration status that you have. Overarching all of this is the enforcement framework, which we keep alluding to. It's the elephant in the room, really, in all of this, where there are all of these rules that have to be complied with: minimum salary, work conditions, so on and so forth, and they're just not being enforced. And when they are being enforced, it feels like a single case. And yeah, it's good that there are some examples of enforcement, but there's no real measure, there's no real transparent understanding of how this is being dealt with. Now, the government's reaction to the recent problems in the care sector was to make it a requirement that sponsors are what's called CQC registered, and this is an enforcement body about care standards, basically, Care Quality Commission. The problem is that a lot of the sponsors that we've come across who are doing the bad practice are already registered with CQC and aren't being investigated by the regulator. So this remedy isn't going to address the problem. So our focus is very much on saying to the government, you need to get better with your enforcement. If you're not going to change the points-based system to make it fairer, and when I say fairer, I mean fairer to the migrants, and what that looks like and how that works is a conversation to be had more broadly. But if they're not even going to tinker and change that, then the focus needs to be on enforcement and ensuring that compliance is being undertaken. And that is a huge undertaking when you think about the numbers of sponsors that have increased on the sponsor register and the number of people who have been sponsored under the system.
Part of the work we're doing in our research on irregularization of migration in Europe is also to look at the ramification of some of these processes we are talking about on other members of the families. And now that, because you were talking about obviously the care sector, in the Home Office has been very clear at the moment of putting a lot of pressure on stopping family reunion or limiting family reunion for the. So I was wondering, to what extent that people comes to you also bring sort of something about the ramification of this uncertainty on other members of the family.
What's really interesting and troubling about this decision is that people who are here now and have a skilled worker visa before the date that the rules came into effect can still sponsor their family members. And we've seen and had reported to us an increase in refusals of people bringing their family members here. So I've had a number of people come to me who are trying to bring their children, and the Home Office putting particularly strange barriers in the way to try and refuse these people in these routes already. And it's particularly distressing people, largely because what you often see is the sponsored employee will come first, and then when they're settled, they've got the home and they've got everything ready, then they will invite their family members to join them. So there is this quite worrying situation where you have some people who are here already and trying to bring their children, in some instances can be young, and they're staying with relatives in their country where they've come from, and they're not able to bring them here because the Home Office is putting these barriers in place. Now, under the new rules, they can't bring any dependents at all. Now, yes, that will probably achieve the desired effect of bringing down numbers, which is obviously the reason why the government has done this. But there's some debate and discussion that essentially it would act as a deterrent to people working in the sector. I think that's to completely alienate and miss the point here, that these are people who are humans and have human relationships, and if they're separated from their family members, that's going to have a real significant detrimental impact. And I'm seeing that impact already within people who are trying to bring their family members here. But there's another side to this, which links back to the cost of living and the precarious employment point that I was making earlier. Having your spouse here with you in the UK, your partner here with you in the UK, they are not restricted in terms of who they can work for. And that can be a lifeline. If you're in a situation where you're being sponsored by a really bad employer and you're not getting hours or something like that, that income from your partner is a life-saving thing. And it gives you that breath, if you like, that opportunity to be able to explore options and not worry so much about the cost of living, because you've got that other person who has that line of income. So to close that is actually to increase the precarious situation that a lot of people are in when they are in a bad employment situation and trying to move to somewhere else.
What this move somehow un, underline or is an idea of shifting maybe from the past, and you obviously worked before with you citizen in UK, from this idea of the principle of freedom of movement of the EU citizenship. So the fact that the people from Europe, for example, were workers, but they were also citizens, to an idea that the migrants are just migrant workers, so they are commodified, so they are here to work. It seems to go back to the 1970s, to Germany and the guest worker schemes. We just want you for your working a time, and then you go back to your own country. So this idea of it seems really underpinning some of this shift.
I think that's right, and I think it's a professionalizing of that. I
Mhm.
think it's the politics of wanting that, meeting a systematic way of doing it, and essentially formalizing and professionalizing that relationship. Now, don't get me wrong; these skilled worker routes do have a pathway to settlement indefinitely to remain in the UK after 5 years, but the truth of the matter is that in that period of time, even for you to get to that stage, you're going through some pretty, not for everybody, to be fair, but most certainly those that we see are going through a really torrid, horrid time before they get to that stage. And I think you're right; it creates that atmosphere of you're a commodity, a utility to be used in the UK economy, rather than a person who has feelings and family members and so on and so forth. And
Look, to somehow to close our conversation, I'd like to take you to think about the situation of EU nationals in particular now in UK. We've seen in the news a lot of stories about French nationals stopped at the border or sent back, or people that had relationships that were broken because and they were refused entry, etc. And also looking at the data from the Home Office, it's very clear that immigration enforcement seems to be paying much more attention to the EU national than ever before. I mean, it's quite interesting to see the presence. So what's going on? Is it the EU national being targeted, or why they appear so often in this kind of stories?
well, I think there's the legal reality, first of all, that Brexit brought about the end of freedom of movement, which meant that border checks could be done in a new way on EU nationals because they're third country nationals. And if you are from the European Union, you have what's called visa-free travel. So you can travel to the UK freely without a visa, but it still means that if you're looking to enter the UK, you either need to have a visa to enter the UK for work, or as a spouse of somebody or something like that, or you need to satisfy, if questioned, the border control that you're a visitor to the UK. Now, this is where the issue arises, and the focus is being honed in on specific nationalities and specific groupings. I think it's difficult to say, but there's definitely, as you rightly pointed out, there has been a spike towards specific nationalities, and there is a targeting of these groups. And the only conclusion that I can draw from that is that there are doubts as to whether they are genuine visitors to the UK. And I think is a consequence of Brexit, but I also think there is perhaps a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding or appreciation of what the rules are for people travelling to the UK. So it's not a surprise to me to see that, because it's a consequence of Brexit. It was going to happen. What's disappointing is that it does seem to be targeted at particular nationals, and that suggests profiling, which is really, really problematic.
One thing that strikes me is that if you look at the stories that comes in the news, in the media, is often to do with Spaniards, Italians, Northern European, French. If you look at the statistics in your office, it's mostly Romanian nationals that are targeted by this immigration enforcement measure. And I think that's a very interesting things to pay attention to, this sort of polarization when and who is targeted and who appears as being targeted.
I totally agree, and it kind of buys into this conversation around who feels empowered enough to make enough noise about their personal circumstances and their experiences of being denied entry at the border. It comes back to the point that we were talking about earlier about awareness of rights, but also that sense of empowerment and that sense of entitlement, I suppose, to be able to come out and be fearless about what you're saying and the experience that you have. I see a lot of Romanians who've been refused at the border wrongly, but there's a big difference between people who speak the language, understand the rules, understand their rights, but also feel empowered and entitled enough to be able to come out and say, hey, this isn't good enough. You shouldn't be doing this to me. So it's no coincidence to me that the profile of people speaking out feel that they can do because of that privilege and that empowerment that they have.
Thank you very much, Luke. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much. Been a pleasure.